featuring John Drayton. My name is Connor Wrighton, and I'll serve as your moderator for today. As many of you may know, the Northwest Gas Association was integral in the founding of the Northwest Alliance for Clean Transportation just this last April. The Alliance has accelerated and amplified the beneficial role of natural gas in transportation applications, and John Drayton has been a key contact to the Alliance. He gave us a big boost on the day of our launch in Tacoma. John recently retired from the Los Angeles Metro, where he oversaw the transition of 2,500 diesel city buses to natural gas. And we're fortunate to have John and look forward to hearing about his experience with NGVs. Before we begin, let's review how these things work. We have, as always, set aside time for questions. We strongly encourage you to ask them as they come up. You can use the text box in the GoToMeeting control panel on the right. Again, you can see the attendees, and 2 or 3 sections below that, you can see the chat. Just type that in and make sure that that is addressed to either the entire audience or to me, and I will introduce your questions as they come up. For those of you who would like a PDF copy of the slide deck, please send me an email, creiten@nwga.org. Often it's just easier to respond to my email from this morning, and I'll make sure I get you a copy of that before close of business today. The presentation is also being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube page this afternoon. I'm also happy to send out a link to that if that's easier for you, or you can visit the NWGA YouTube page where we will have this, as well as our entire cache of webinar recordings from the last several years. So we encourage you to visit there. As some of you may know, the Northwest Gas Association hosts webinars like these each month. Next month, we're going to be keeping the webinar in-house with the NWGA Executive Director, Dan Kirshner, who will be giving his annual presentation on the latest Northwest Gas Association Gas Outlook Study. We have scheduled out our webinar circuit through the beginning of 2019. We will have an election wrap-up coming up in January, which will be analyzing the new look of Congress and what that means for the natural gas industry. So that should be very interesting, and we hope you will join us for that as well. As always, we have been telling you to join us June 5th and 6th at Skamania Lodge for the annual energy conference since roughly June 10th of 2018. You should mark that time off on your calendar. We hope to see all of you there. It is a terrific event, and we want to make sure that as many of you are able to attend as possible. So finally, I just want to introduce the Northwest Gas Association for those of you who are not familiar with us. We represent the 6 investor-owned gas utilities operating in the Pacific Northwest, along with the 3 large natural gas transmission lines. Our members represent Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and British Columbia, and you can visit our website at nwga.org for more information. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to John, and we will get things started. John, are you seeing the prompt for taking that over? There we go. And I'm wondering if you're still on mute because I cannot hear you yet. Let's see. John, I'm seeing everything just great, but I'm still not hearing you.
Hello?
Hey, there we are.
All right, hopefully you can hear me now.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me start by saying thank you to the Northwest Gas Association and Northwest Alliance for inviting me to speak for a few minutes. A little bit of background: for about 25 years, I worked for LA Metro, and I was directly involved in their transition from diesel vehicles to natural gas vehicles. So we're going to talk a little bit about the LA story. To give you a little personal history, I grew up in the LA area, and I remember being in high school running
John,
or
I'm
doing anything athletic. The good something like 4 years. We used to have as many as 200 a year when I was a teenager. So seeing them, see if I can control this.
John, we're getting a little bit of choppiness with your audio. I'm not sure if there's something going on that end, but I think we have you now.
Okay. So a little bit of history. If we go back to the 60s and 70s, the LA Basin was easily the smoggiest major city in the US, if not the world. And there was a concerted effort at federal, state, and local levels to try and take steps to improve air quality. Starting as far back as the 70s, LA Metro, where I worked, and it's a little bit before my time, did a lot of different experiments with different types of diesel engines. They even tried an experiment with a diesel locomotive engine to see if they could find paths to reduce smog and emissions and improve air quality. So let me walk through this real quick. So in the 70s, EPA names Los Angeles their first severe non-attainment region. And there's a number of implications that basically go to steps the region needs to take to start cleaning up air quality. All through the 80s and up and through the early 90s, our air quality management district took a number of actions, you know, trying to, you know, going to little things like catalytic converters became mandatory. We went to unleaded fuel. You know, and then more locally, where I was working, the year I started at LA Metro adopted an alternative fuel only policy. They agreed starting in 1992, they would stop buying any diesel engines. In 2000,
never accepted the meeting.
Hello. In 2000, LA Metro, after experimenting with methanol, ethanol, and CNG, adopted that CNG would be the fuel of choice at LA Metro. Of those three options, it was the easiest to operate in the engine, it was the cheapest and the cleanest. Going forward, and also in 2000, I helped LA Metro. We wrote a plan on how to make a transition from, you know, diesel operation to 100% CNG operation. That also was adopted. It took us about 11 years from that point. Our fleet's about 2,400 buses, so we were replacing about 200 buses a year on average. And in 2011, we celebrated getting rid of our last diesel bus. And about the same time, just to put in perspective our operation, we were running about 100 million miles annually. And also during 2011, we passed through 2 billion miles running on natural gas at LA Metro. And just going forward, we adopted a couple programs my last year at Metro. We committed to transferring to 100% renewable natural gas. All our contracts today at LA Metro are for renewable natural gas. We'll get into why that's important. We also committed to transitioning to Cummins' new low NOx engine. That engine's incredible. It's a very minor change from the previous generation of Cummins L-Gas Plus engines and ISLGs, but that engine is 99% cleaner than EPA standards. And then finally, also last year, we started a slow transition to battery electric buses. I'll get into a little bit of discussion at the end of this, why that made battery electric buses certainly have a lot of promise. They might not be the panacea everyone's hoping for. I'm still very bullish on RNG and low NOx engines, and we'll talk about why that's important. So getting back to my track and cross country careers back in the 1970s, 1980s, excuse me, you can see by this chart, back in the 70s, we saw as many as 200 smog alerts, 200 stage 1 smog alerts in the course of a year. That's more than every other day. And if you go forward to 2018, we have not seen a smog alert in Los Angeles in the last 4 years. And the big point here is the combination of regulation and technology can have a big impact on your region's air quality. Let me step back and jump up to 30,000 feet for a few minutes here. We're going to talk about hydrocarbons. And one of our simple rules is this is a little bit like you are what you eat. What you put into an engine has a direct impact on what comes out of that engine. You can see just the graphic representation of here what a molecule of methane gas looks like, CH4. There's relatively little, almost no carbon in methane gas. Because of that, there's very little particulate that comes out of methane combustion. By contrast, many of the other more complex hydrocarbons, the diesels, the gasoline, even coal, which is a form of a hydrocarbon, the carbon intensity gets higher as you go up that chain, and hence you get correspondingly more particulate. So if we think about from the simplest hydrocarbons to the most complex, you have hydrogen, which is no carbon, very clean fuel. Unfortunately, it's a very expensive fuel that's difficult to handle. I can talk a little bit about it if there's interest a little bit later. Methane, or as we know it, natural gas, and it can come in the form of liquefied natural gas, a cryogenic fuel, or more commonly, most operators are using compressed natural gas, which is an odorless, colorless gas, and it's usually pushed through pipelines around the country. Again, it's one of the lowest fuel cost options, and it's one of the lowest emission options. And then as we go up in the hydrocarbons, you have gasolines, diesels, coals. Battery electrics are running on electricity, and one of the things we often overlook is the fact that electricity has to come from somewhere, and primarily it is sourced from hydrocarbons. I know up in the Northwest there, you do have a lot of hydroelectric power, but if we look at energy on a global scale or on a national scale, the vast majority of our electricity is coming from coal and diesel and natural gas power plants. And then two others that I just have here for reference. You'll hear me use the term biogas or RNG, renewable natural gas, somewhat interchangeably. Effectively, they're just different forms of methane that's come from a renewable source. It burns the same, it looks the same, it has the same chemical composition as methane gas. It's just a matter of where it was sourced and when it was manufactured. And then the other one you'll hear us refer to a little bit as greenhouse gas, GHG. That can be CO2, it can be CH4, which is methane, it can be ozone. And one of the things we are mindful of is that methane on its own is a greenhouse gas. And anytime we can capture methane, especially a biosource methane, let's say out of a digester at a cattle farm, there are ample opportunities to get methane at a sub-zero amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And Connor, am I coming across okay still? I'm just talking here, so yeah. If this
Everything
is coming across,
looks and sounds great.
So there's been, down in California, we've had a number of clean air incentive programs that have come out, and this has really catalyzed the transition away from diesel engines. We have a low carbon fuel standard. We have a heavy duty vehicle incentive program, HVIP. Both those programs are administered by the California Air Resources Board, and both those heavily incentivize moving off hydrocarbons basically and into either a natural gas or a zero emission propulsion system. There are a number of other incentives for both zero emission and near zero emission technologies. Frankly, I think we're putting too much into the zero emission in California, not enough into the near zero. There's, one of the statistics we have is that for every bus we put out in the road with a zero emission engine, there's 30 diesel trucks still driving down the highway. So we're not nearly as effective on air quality as we could be if we've got more aggressive on the trucking side. Our other programs in California have increased the taxes on conventional fuels, and some of that funding goes back to our highways, but some of it also goes to transportation options. There's a number of incentive programs also for renewable natural gas. I'll get into cost figures in a few minutes, but renewable natural gas is 20 to 30% cheaper than pipeline gas at this point. We actually at LA Metro have saved hundreds of millions of dollars in fuel costs by going not just to natural gas, but to renewable natural gas. And bottom line here is both CARB and the California Energy Commission have come up with a number of incentive programs to take away any of the upfront costs that are associated with going to cleaner technologies. I don't know offhand how much that's happening in Oregon and Washington in the Northwest region, but again, we're trying to get people to voluntarily in the state of California move to the cleanest available technologies. Some quick notes here about renewable natural gas and low NOx engines. LA Metro recognized the benefit of Cummins engine a couple of years ago. We did a demonstration with several engines. It worked out very, very effectively. Those engines are 90% cleaner than the CNG engines they're replacing. We embarked on a program in 2017 to migrate away from a standard CNG engine, and we're going to be 100% low NOx CNG engines by 2024. That will reduce emissions. You know, we already, LA Metro like to think that we had the cleanest transit fleet of any major city in the world. We'll take that fleet from where it had been, and it will be 90% plus cleaner within the next 5 years. Another thing, we did a big study on different fuel and engine options and propulsion options at LA Metro, looking at both zero emission options and near zero options. One of the big conclusions in this report is called the Ramble report. I can get copies back to Connor if there's interest. But one of the final report was that LA Metro realizes 99% of the air quality benefits of going to a pure zero emission solution in half the time by going to renewable natural gas and low NOx. Part of that has to do with the fact that we can implement that technology immediately and are doing so. But the engine and the combination of the new engine and renewable natural gas, again, you're splitting hair to say that there's any air difference between a zero emission battery electric bus and a low NOx engine running on renewable natural gas. They really have comparable air quality benefits even today in 2018. One of the interesting things about the near zero engine, they took one of our buses out to UC Riverside for testing. It was one of the few facilities in the country that can even test at that level. One of the interesting stories I heard, testing, they used to be able to test engines in about a day. The new testing, especially for particulate, take 3 to 4 days. And part of the issue there is there's so little particulate coming out of that engine, it takes that long to build up any particulate exhaust. So it's heavy and weigh the diff. So it takes 3 days of running an engine to build up enough particulate to weigh it. Renewable natural gas, whether it's coming from a landfill or a biosource, is 80% than conventional pipeline gas. It's a very beneficial approach. If any of you have waste haulers in your region, if any of you have cattle farms, there are likely sources of RNG, if untapped, they can dramatically reduce your greenhouse gas footprint. The other thing about this approach is that the changes that went into the low NOx engine are very minor and are not technically challenging. There's a slight timing change in the exhaust, and there was a different exhaust catalyst put on the engine, but there's virtually no technology risk in transitioning to the latest generation CNG engine. In fact, if anything, the reliability LA Metro's fleet was flat between the implementation of the conventional CNG engines to the low NOx engines. Could I just jump down, and this may be applicable again in your region. most of the California's greenhouse gas emissions is actually from agriculture. It's not from one of the big issues that we see, and one of the big opportunities is finding ways to recapture that renewable natural gas or biogas. Anywhere that you have opportunities to capture that, RNG can actually have a negative carbon intensity. So if you're trading emission reduction credits or greenhouse gas reduction credits, RNG actually can be less than zero. It can have a negative greenhouse gas. It can be cleaner than zero emission, if you will. So just to put all this in perspective, hopefully you can see a picture. This is a 1990 RTS2 bus, probably the most common bus in operation through probably the early 2000s. At various points, Metro had as many as 2,000 of these buses. This bus would have been certified to probably 1992 levels. And if we go back, kind of unregulated emissions, our NOx grams per brake horsepower hour was about 10.8 grams, and particulate was about 0.6. Let me put that in perspective today. We come over to 2010. This is the current US standard. So we've gone from 10.8 grams NOx and 6 grams particulate down to 0.2 and 0.01. And that would be comparable to our last generation CNG engine. And so that one 1990 era bus is equivalent to about 54, current generation CNG buses. And here's where it gets cool. Let's jump over into our low NOx engine. And one low NOx engine, and these are the certification levels, one low NOx or one 1990 era bus is the equivalent of about 500 of these low NOx CNG engines. And when we really consider that the testing, when they tested this engine, was tested at 0.01 grams NOx, you actually can see that that one diesel bus CNG engines, or the other way you can look at it, 2 of those 1990 buses put out more emissions than Metro's entire daily operation. I'm going to let that sink in for a second, but it's the amount of emissions reductions achieved in the latest generation natural gas engines is stunning. So let's talk about cost for a little bit. This graph here, the red line, shows diesel fuel costs in a cost per mile basis. So this is apples to apples. The blue line is CNG fuel costs, including the cost of compressing the fuel. If you look back in the mid 2000s, 2005, you can see these lines followed each other relatively closely through about 2005. And about that point, the line separated significantly. As I go back and look at averages going back to the early 2000s, our diesel fuel cost per mile has been hovering. It's been between 50 cents and $1 per mile. CNG costs have been under 50 cents a mile consistently. When I look at the dollars spent on natural gas versus diesel over the last 15 years, LA Metro has saved over $500 million in fuel costs by going on natural gas. And just for reference, I did look up today's costs. Diesel fuel costs at LA Metro today were $3.38 per gallon. That translates to just a hair under $1 per mile. The CNG fuel cost was 42 cents per therm, and we get about 2.2 miles per therm. So the direct cost for CNG fuel is a little bit under 25 cents a mile. So we're saving somewhere around 70 cents per mile in daily operation. And keep in mind, LA Metro runs 100 million miles every year. So we're saving some real dollars by not being on diesel fuel. And a little bit of that savings, I'd say that 20 to 30% of the CNG cost drop is using renewable natural gas and all the incentives that come with that. So I'm going to wrap up here and take some questions, but here's some big lessons that if you walk away from this presentation with a few key things. The number one is the combination of technology and regulation can have a huge impact on your region's air quality. The technology is there today, especially with renewable natural gas, low NOx engines, impact on tailpipe emissions coming out of your fleets, and that's not limited to buses. That's available to any application. There are a number of factors that need to be considered when you're looking into migrating to a new fuel. There's been a lot of push for electric vehicles in California. The reality is we're not seeing the vehicle today, the bus today, that can meet all the requirements operating. I mean, most of the bus we've looked at, and I a lot of time in that I still consult with properties looking to go to electric vehicles. The best buses out there today get maybe 150 miles operating range, which really isn't enough to meet the daily operating requirements. The bottom line here is making sure we're looking at every tool in our toolbox. There is no single right answer to what technology is most suitable for a given application. It takes work, it takes planning, it takes some modeling efforts. Again, I don't want people to lose sight that one of the nice things coming out of natural gas these days is it's one of the impact on your region's air quality. And last thing here is California will be considering a innovative clean transit rule that effectively courses all the transit operators to move into zero emission vehicles by 2040. I wrote an opinion piece here a couple of weeks ago that you can pull up, and it gets into a little more detail about some of the trade-offs between natural gas and battery electric vehicles. And with that, hopefully I haven't rambled too much, and I'd be more than happy to take any questions that people have.
Terrific. Well, thank you, John. First off, I want to apologize, folks, for some of the audio issues that we're having, but I think we were able to get a lot of really spectacular information out of that, so really appreciate it. One question that I would posit, first I'll mention once again, folks, put your question in the chat box. Make sure that that's addressed either to the entire audience or to me, and we'll make sure we get to that right now. But the first question I would ask is, what is the status of LA Metro's transition or small scale transition over to battery electric? I know that you guys had 5 of them, or they had 5 of them. What is the story with that today?
Well, LA Metro bought 5 BYD buses in 2014. They were delivered over a year late. They had a number of design and manufacturing defects. I mean, the doors wouldn't work. I think at one point we were getting as little as 200 miles between road call. That basically a bus was in a road call almost every single day. After a lot of negotiation with the manufacturer, they agreed to buy those buses back from LA. And despite that experience, LA Metro's board decided to aggressively invest in additional buses. They currently have 105 electric buses on order. None have been delivered yet. And I mean, statewide in California, I think there's around 150 roughly battery electric buses in operation. The experience has been very mixed, and it remains to be seen what level, battery technology is evolving so quickly. I do expect battery buses to play a meaningful role in the future, but at the moment, out of the 10,000 plus buses in the state of California, only about 150 are currently operating on battery electric.
Interesting. Thanks, John. We'll give folks about 2 more minutes to put their questions down. Again, I will note that we are recording, and we will put this up on YouTube later for those of you who may have colleagues who missed out, but would really like to get in a couple of good questions before we move on. I know that this has been a really key issue in the Pacific Northwest lately, as there's been a lot of contemplation through Portland and Seattle and other areas that are considering transitions from their diesel bus fleets. So this has really been top of mind for us as well. And John, along those lines, have you been working with any of the folks in the Pacific Northwest, or do you have any sense for some of the transitions that may be happening here?
Only a little bit. I work a lot with a WSP, which is a large engineering firm. They have a contract or part of a contract with Spokane. And so I expect to be doing a little bit of advisory work there. We're looking at some other jobs in the region, potentially TriMet, looking at their fleet. But most of my work at the moment is East Coast, Boston and Baltimore, and then as well as the Southern California region.
Sure. What is Spokane's approach? Is the first question here.
Well, that's a good question. They have a large yard that they are looking at what their options are and retrofitting their yard. And I haven't dug too much into that one. I'm not the lead on that project, but I certainly could dig in if there were questions about it.
Sure. All right, well, I'm going to give folks about 30 more seconds to put their questions in. Often they sort of cascade into the last second, and I don't want to cut anybody off. In the meantime, John, really want to express our appreciation for your time here and for all the help that you have given the Northwest Alliance for Clean Transportation. It's very much appreciated, and we're looking forward to continuing to work together moving forward.
Great.
All right, well, seeing no questions, again, if you have any that occur to you, please send John an email right here. It is john@drayton.consulting. Otherwise, send me an email if you're interested in seeing the PowerPoint. I know that I've already fielded a few of those, and I will respond here shortly. And we will have this up on YouTube in the next half an hour or so. And we'll look forward to getting back together again next month.
All right, thank you so much, Connor.
Thank you.
All right.